All right, Mike, the recording has started. You are free to go in 3, 2, and 1.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Container Storage and the New Data Paradigm. I'm your host, Mike Vizard. We have 3 awesome speakers today, but first, we got to do a little housekeeping stuff. So I want to direct your attention to the chat button you'll see on your screen. We want this whole presentation to be interactive, and these folks are going to be basically having a conversation on this topic, and we're inviting you to join, and we'll be looking for your contributions in that chat button, and then we'll relay it to our speakers who can also see those chats as well as I can. We also have some gift cards to give away today. They are from Amazon, so stay to the end and find out who's going to win 4 different gift cards. Our speakers today are Gaurav Rishi, who's the Vice President of Product for Castin by Veeam. Gaurav, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mike. Nice to be here.
Then we have Joe Gardner, who's the Field Solutions Architect for the Office of the CTO of Portworx by Pure Storage. I'm sensing a theme here in the marketing of these companies. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mike. Happy to be here.
And finally, we have Andrew Park, who's a Global Specialist in Solutions Architecture for Amazon Web Services. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
All right. Let's just start out with some explanation of what makes container storage different, and I want to address that to Andrew. We've all been doing some level of storage forever, so what made storage in the land of containers different than what we historically have done?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I guess the way I would approach this question is that when you think about containers just by themselves without anything else, without orchestration or anything else like that, the one thing people tend to forget about containers is that it's ephemeral. So if that container goes down, all the data that you would want to save is going to be gone. And so you need to figure out a way to persist that data, whether it's to something like EFS, whether it's a persistent volume that you created via something like Kubernetes. And so when you think about this in production, when you have hundreds, maybe thousands of containers running in production, you have to figure out an efficient way to store all that data or persist that data so that you don't lose it, right? And so, if it's a simple task and you just need a container to go up and down to do a single task, then sure, realistically speaking, that data is going to be saved through the host operating system, and that's fine, right? And that's all you need. But if you're running something like a WordPress site or like a blog or even like an e-commerce application, you need a way to save and persist that data in a way where you're not going to lose it. Because if you think about situations where you have to handle customer data, like you can't lose that, right? And you need an efficient way to persist it. And so that's why it becomes difficult, because when you think about customer data and all this quote unquote sensitive data that you need to save, you need an efficient way to do that. And on top of that, you also need an efficient way to be able to pull that data in situations where, that data is critical. So that's kind of where I would start off. And that's kind of where I see the typical challenges when it comes to container storage, whether that's on AWS, whether that's on another platform. Those are some of the common things that I see when it comes to figuring out the most efficient way to go about container storage. But that's my particular outlook on container storage. But I'll hand it off to Gaurav and Joe to see kind of what they think about that.
Yeah, so I think you nailed it, right? The reality is that as orchestration comes into the picture, and you have this highly dynamic distributed system called Kubernetes that's moving workloads around freely, things fail, it brings them back somewhere else. Suddenly managing data in that highly dynamic environment becomes really challenging, right? And you start to think, well, if a stateless compute workload can be brought back in a few seconds without any interaction from any kind of administrator, how does data play in that scenario? And I think that's why there's a differentiation between kind of traditional storage and container storage, because the environment in which we're running our compute is so different to maybe a machine-centric way of running those workloads.
All right. Gaurav, you want to add to that? Do you think it's pretty much just the ephemeral nature, or is there something else going on here?
I think the dynamism is, of course, key, and I think both Andrew and Joe explained that well. I think the other part I'll just point out is the diversity aspect of it. I think Kubernetes brings with it the promise, and I think the reality of portability. And so what we're also seeing is essentially storage being a lot more distributed, and deployments being across locations, whether it's the cloud and premises and so on. So I think when we talk about state and maintaining that, we also need to sort of think about doing this in an environment which is not only dynamic, where you have these spinning pods up and down, so you need to decouple the life cycle. You also need to think about having that solution which can then work across and get the richness that each one of the vendors and each one of the cloud providers can bring to it. So to me, that's the other part, which is quite interesting and quite different.
Joe, you're the field CTO, so you're out there all the time. What do you wish people knew about container storage, or what are the mistakes that you see people continually making and you're kind of like rolling your eyes going, do I have to solve this problem again? What's that kind of most annoying thing out there?
Wow, that's some inside baseball, right? It's a difficult one. I think a lot of this is driven by maturity, right? And for me, we're kind of at the top of that maturity bell curve, where we now have kind of vendor proliferation in the Kubernetes space. And what's driving a lot of the challenges around storage right now, the reason I think it's becoming acute is because of that maturity, changing the kind of applications that are being run in containers. So, if we look at the purist approach, as Andrew was saying, like, containers are ephemeral, right? They can die, they can come back, they should be stateless, but that's not the reality. That's not how people are using them. And the technology is really being driven by the way that the users want to consume it, right? And so what we're seeing now is that actually enterprise applications are being containerized and running Kubernetes. And that means increasingly critical workloads that have a direct impact on the business reputation, the customer's experience of that organization's services, sensitive data now being stored in these environments. But the problem is there's a natural assumption that as we start to bring these critical workloads into Kubernetes, well, we've already made a huge investment in storage, right? Maybe we've got storage arrays, maybe we're running in public cloud, and we've got automation around provisioning storage in that environment. And I actually agree that for less critical stateful workloads, those solutions are suitable, right? But as you increase that criticality, all of the points that we've just been talking about around that idea of orchestration and being able to rapidly recover and ensuring your data is always available in heterogeneous environments, and being able to really operate your storage at the same speed as your compute, that's really misunderstood until you actually hit those pain points, right? And when you do, the impact of that on running those critical workloads in production, or your whole kind of business project around modernizing those workloads, can be pretty significant. So it's very difficult to kind of cut people off at that pass and kind of educate them on that. But I think the way the industry is now, the thinking is starting to come around to that and to understand that actually we do need to look at not just storage, right? Networking and security and monitoring and storage in a different way when we're running these containerized workloads in Kubernetes.
Gaurav, you've been around this space for a long time. Do you think that what Joe was talking about with latency essentially impacting the containers and they're being somewhat more sensitive, that it is a different mindset? It isn't about scaling up, it's about scaling out more often. And does that change the way people need to think about the whole paradigm?
No, absolutely. I think I know we throw this sort of phrase internally, which is Kubernetes is not just a technology, it's almost a state of mind. And I think what that reflects is point that you are highlighting, which is essentially everything, not from starting from software development, the way you operate it, the way you expect to surface your products, the frequency at which you release, all of those are very much go hand in hand with the development deployment methodologies that Kubernetes expects. So I think that's it. From to your exact point, when we talk about latencies and things of that nature, of course, it goes back very quickly to the pets versus cattle type model, where we need to go ahead and not only think about scaling out. I think in some ways, and maybe maybe the group here is already drinking that. So it's preaching to the choir, but the debate is more or less over in terms of the advantages that microservices and event-driven architectures bring to a solution, right? So re-architecting your solutions or having a bridge to get to that, and different companies are very much in different phases of where they might be. And I think the important part is to go and meet the customers where they are and not really where you want them to be. So to me, it's here and now. But the cloud native mindset is here to stay. So from my perspective, not getting tied to a particular region or a node, or having the key concepts of having application mobility that helps you, but yet manages the latency aspects of it and keeps the portability point I was making, are really the key points that we need to keep in mind.
All right, I hear that pets versus cattle thing all the time, and I'm like, anybody been to Texas know how much a head of cattle costs. So maybe this is not the best metaphor going, but we'll see.
I'm a vegetarian, so I don't even like subscribe to the whole thing. But anyway, that's a different story.
All right. Andrew, we hear a lot about stateful applications these days, and there's a huge debate on this subject, right? A lot of people will say, well, we're using containers to build stateless applications, and there's really nothing that's truly stateless because eventually the data gets stored somewhere. And now we're talking about stateful applications that either run on the cluster itself or in the case of Kubernetes or somewhere nearby. What is your take on why should we build stateful applications versus just, continue to run stateless stuff and store the data somewhere else when we get to it?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because I don't think it's a matter of stateless versus stateful. I think you kind of have to, kind of like Rob mentioned, you have to kind of meet the customer where they are and you have to understand the nature of their applications. You can't just go to a customer and say, hey, like, you should change the nature of the way you build your application so that everything's stateless or stateful. Like, I don't think that's necessarily the right approach. It's because every application is different. Every customer is going to have different requirements. And we think about folks like in financial services or healthcare and life sciences, those requirements are going to change drastically, right? Or what if you have data residency requirements that you need to abide by, right? That's going to change the way you think about, do I need to go stateless or stateful? And what does that actually mean for my applications, my environment, right? And so, I think we're seeing an increase in stateful applications on Kubernetes in that, we provide an elastic file storage solution where you can persist your data to EFS and have all your pods and your workloads kind of pull and push data to and from that elastic file storage solution that we have. And so that's something that we're seeing a lot more just because people are starting to figure out, hey, like my application doesn't necessarily need to be stateless, right? And if we have a requirement for our application to be stateful, like we have options to where we can still run our applications Kubernetes and have that same level of performance using stateful workloads because we have those different storage options, right? So for me, it's not necessarily like, is it a stateful versus stateless conversation? It's more about what are my actual requirements and how do I build around that so that I'm actually meeting those requirements for my customers, right? And so I think, for folks that are new to Kubernetes and are trying to figure out a strategy around this, I would encourage you to kind of have that deep level conversation with your organization to figure out, is this actually what I need? Because that's drastically going to change the way that you build and architect your applications. And I'm sure Joe and Graf have these conversations all the time where it's a maturity thing, right? It's like, how much do you actually understand the landscape to where you can actually use those solutions for your organization? So I'll let Joe and Graf speak to this teach because I do think it's an important topic. That's just my perspective and my experience working with customers in this space.
Joe, you want to jump in there? Because are you seeing a lot more stateful applications and what drives that per se?
Yeah, definitely. I think you have to go back to not to be too dry, the sort of business case behind using containers in the first place, right? We've definitely gone from small development teams playing around with containerization, running a Docker swarm, right? And now, it's now kind of a standard for a lot of organizations. And you have to look at the reasons why. And the reality is that, yes, you've got all the benefits of, as we've been saying, portability, it's more agile, it becomes a standard packaging format, it helps you move between environments. But actually, you can also use it to massively consolidate your infrastructure costs. I saw organizations using containers to not refactor legacy applications, just to package them in a way that made them easier to move. And that got them away from custom support contracts for end-of-life operating systems. And I think we forget that actually it's a catalyst for a lot of cost reduction, potentially, right? And the reality is that most organizations start with stateless apps because it's easier, right? It's a lot easier to run a Python script or a web application or whatever it happens to be than it is to run a Postgres, right? But if you've got a business case that's driving cost reduction, you're not really going to see those big payoffs if you don't target most of your enterprise application landscape, which is going to be stateful. right? And so I think it's natural that you kind of want to supersize your business case by targeting those apps. And so that's kind of that natural, as Andrew was saying, it's that natural kind of maturity where you quickly burn through the 20% of stateless apps that you have in your organization. And then actually the other 80% are the ones that have that big impact on the bottom line. And so that's where a lot of organizations are now looking, which is why stateless, I think, is becoming such a hot topic. Sorry, stateful is becoming such a hot topic.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe add a couple of things, and maybe I'll pick up on Joe's sort of dry economic thread. If I kind of look at it from a sort of supply-demand point of view, on the demand side, if I look at really what are the Kubernetes applications that are driving usage today, increasingly we see sort of data analytics, AI, ML type workloads, right? And the reason people are using those are under the covers because of the business benefits that Joe was alluding to. So first of all of those require data, and you require state. On the supply side of it, Kubernetes on one hand is a young ecosystem, but it's an extremely dynamic ecosystem too. So innovation, when I look around the ecosystem, is everywhere, whether it's the physical layer where we see things like NVMe, or whether we look at people redesigning databases to take these cloud native architecture principles. Kate Sandra is an example of that. Or we talk about software defined storage. I'm sure Joe and Andrew can talk a lot more intelligently about that versus me. All of these, whether it's Longhorn also, all of these things. And then also, not to miss, I mean, there are vendor specific supports like, VMware with Tanzu sort of bringing that into the mainstream, where I can see all of these on the supply side of the equation being drivers to make state something that becomes mainstream increasingly on the Kubernetes side.
All right. Andrew, let's follow up on that conversation a little bit with you, because one of the things that's obvious in the land of the cloud is you don't really see many storage administrators who are managing the cloud. It's kind of all part and parcel of the compute, and the storage is all melded together. Do you think that is the trend that we're going to see? And maybe one of the reasons we're starting to see more stateful applications on Kubernetes is because one person or a small team of people are now trying to manage the entire infrastructure end to end, and there isn't some external storage administrator that you can call on for support or service or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think what you just said right there kind of nails it right on the head. Because if you think about it from a developer's perspective, realistically speaking, they don't really care how storage is provisioned. All they care about is, do I have access to it? Can I push my data to it? And that's it, right? And it really becomes this issue of platform ops, DevOps, SREs versus your developer teams, in that how do you build that relationship so that your developers have all the resources that they need, which obviously includes storage, right? Because I'll tell you, I've talked to tons of developer teams and they do not care. Like, it is not something they're thinking about, but they do expect it to be there, right? Because they do need it to do their job, and it is very important. So then, the question becomes like, how do you facilitate that healthy relationship between your DevOps, your platform ops, and your developer teams? Because I think storage is probably a core component of that, right? Because if your developers in the apps that they're developing don't have a way to persist that data or that data to your S3 bucket, your EFS, or wherever it might be, it's a pretty big miss, right? Because, like we mentioned before, if those containers go down, or if there's an incident, at the end of the day, people are pointing fingers at each other. Well, you didn't provision the storage. Well, you didn't check, it's just back and forth that doesn't even need to be there in the first place, right? So I think a lot of things have come out recently that kind of help solve that problem, whether it's using like a managed solution like S3 or EFS, to where it's just easier to manage. Or, if you look at the cloud native ecosystem, there are so many different solutions for storage that can kind of help solve those issues. And again, it just always goes back to the business use case. Like, what's going to be best for my business? Am I just trying to save money? Is scale an issue? Is it high availability? Like, what does disaster recovery actually look like? There's a lot of questions that you really need to ask yourself when it comes to picking the right storage solution, because there's going to be different use cases. There's going to be different business use cases. Cost is always going to be a factor when you take things like this in consideration. I think there's a lot that goes into this, but I think, like, when I think about different storage solutions, I always just think about what's going to make it easiest on the organization themselves, right? Like, what's going to make it the easiest for folks to get started right away, and go to market quicker. So I think there's a lot of questions there, but when I typically have these conversations, that's typically the way I think about it.
All right, Joe, some of your best friends are storage administrators. So where do they fit in this conversation? And, how do you see this evolving?
Well, funnily enough, I don't come from a storage background. So my background's actually in kind of software vendors, DevOps, those kind of organizations. So since joining Pure Storage, it has been a bit of a shock to the system, right? Because it's kind of a new world to me. But I think Andrew nailed it in that the roles are changing. And there's a kind of a dynamic that I found quite interesting in that storage administrators are now kind of referring to themselves as like storage services or kind of storage platform engineers. It's changed, right? And I think it reflects kind of what Kubernetes is enabling as well, that everything is a service idea where you bring up a platform that's Kubernetes based, and then you've got sort of 5 or 6 options around how you expose that to the consumer. Is it going to be database as a service? Is it going to be platform as a service? Namespace as a service, right? There's a whole load of ways that you can carve it up. And behind the scenes, you're going to have infrastructure as a service, which might be VMware based. It might be OpenStack. There might be some public cloud. And now you've got storage services as well, which are essentially providing protocols, right? We don't, and as Andrew was saying, developers don't care. I need a bucket, right? I need a file share. I don't really care where it's coming from. I just need a performant, resilient protocol that I can consume within my application. And I think that trend is pervasive now across the stack.
All right, Gaurav, you want to add to that? It seems to me we're kind of pointing towards data engineering. Anytime I hear the word engineering, I'm kind of like, well, that means eventually it becomes an extension of my DevOps process somewhere along the line. So is that how this is all going to evolve, do you think? Is storage becoming part of the whole DevOps motion?
Very much so. I think the other word, just like your pets and cattle, which I'm sure is overloaded and you hear about, is this whole shift left point of view. And I think that very much reflects and consumes, this point. I think I see a retitling, right? I mean, I see it might be the same person who was kind of doing storage administrator, but the kind of titling we might see is a platform architect or a cloud architect, or sometimes even SRE gets munged in there. But I think those are all sort of early indicators to the point that, hey, look, let's go ahead and abstract the actual implementation from the requirements, the business requirements of what application needs as storage. And, that then becomes reflected in how people, think of their roles and also act on those roles and accordingly. So I think this is a continuum, like we were talking about. Not everybody is there yet, but the early indicators definitely. I watch the titles and I see the people, and I think to me that's a trend.
All right. I think he said if you're a storage administrator and you call yourself a data engineer, you're going to get a raise, right?
Yeah, only half joking. I think I've seen a survey like that. I will try and get people on for that.
All right. Joe, let me ask you something. When we started playing around with storage in the early days, right, it was basically you had hard drives and solid state drives. It seems like there's more persistence now showing up in memory. So how is the storage architecture changing? Or how do we think about persistent storage is different? And are all these things a continuum? And do I need to figure out how to kind of balance them? How will that play out?
Well, I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges. Is it kind of plays into that hybrid cloud point as well. In that, actually, we have really diverse infrastructure landscapes, and a lot of organizations have been trying to consolidate for a long time, but I haven't seen many that have been successful in doing that, right? And that's kind of one of the benefits of Kubernetes, in that it creates that consistent overlay across any underlying server infrastructure. So you end up with this common control plane that is the same anywhere that you run it, right? So you can run a Kubernetes on top of on-premise physical machines, in the cloud, and you get exactly the same target that you can point your pipelines at, as we were hearing about earlier. And I think really to address that point around, well, how do you balance that? You need to take the same approach from a storage perspective and create that overlay model, have some kind of abstraction so that you have a common control plane, allowing your development teams, your data scientists, the consumers of your environments to not actually be concerned with what that underlying infrastructure is. And then really you just start presenting classes of storage right? You don't need to know anything else as a consumer. And that's the model that I see working very well. But yeah, that balance between how do we benefit from our investment in storage and provide that kind of consistent way of consuming it with the need to be agile and to innovate and to support these new stack environments is a difficult one, right? Absolutely, it's a challenge that comes up a lot.
All right, Gaurav, do you want to add to that? Because it seems like I feel like the paradigm that is shifting here is that we created the data in the context of an application historically, and then we stored it somewhere for that application to use. And now it feels like the data is being managed in isolation from the compute and the application. So is the data itself a new layer of management construct? I mean, we've been talking about data management for years, but I feel like it's now becoming independent of the applications and the compute. And is that kind of the way to think about this?
Yeah, so lots of threads to pull on there. So let's start with the original point about the storage piece of it. I mean, if I had to sort of just set a vocabulary, you've got the block file NFS objects as your typical implementations of storage. Now, those could be on premises or those could be in the cloud. And like I talked about earlier, I think diversity is here to stay. And I think every vendor is looking to provide the best capabilities, whether it's higher availability, resiliency, etc. And so first of all, I think we want to make sure when you're designing your applications, you are able to take those benefits. So on one hand, it's making sure you have a consistent way of consuming them. But on the other hand, you don't want to sort of go ahead and have overlays in a way or a common denominator which hides away some of the innovation that is going down the path. Now, the other point I wanted to make was, and this goes back to the developer mindset, a lot of people actually don't even talk about the vocabulary in terms of block, file, or object. The level of abstraction that Kubernetes and shift left has brought in is they think about database level. When you talk about storage, they think about like a SQL API. And I think if you look at what's happening in the community with things like the Rook operator, where you might have Ceph under the covers, but you've managed to get the Kubernetes operator pattern in there, you can now have a developer talking about storage in terms of a much higher level of abstraction. It's not the same thing that you grew up with. And now you have operators coming up for even things like Cassandra and Yugabyte and so on. So I think that's another new thing which we are seeing, which I know you were only half joking about the data engineering part of it, but there is truth to it when you think about it in that particular context. So I think those are the kind of things I'm seeing in the Kubernetes world, which are brand new, we did not see before. And I think that's a really healthy thing for the ecosystem, because that's what gets the developer productivity and increases the business value for working in this environment.
Andrew, what's your take on this whole hybrid cloud trend, and where does data kind of sit in this equation, and how will we get there?
Yeah, it's I think the hybrid cloud is something that you're seeing a lot more nowadays. I know I've certainly seen it a lot more recently. And so the thing is like when you think about folks that want to take the hybrid cloud approach, you have to kind of understand like where they're coming from, in that, a lot of these folks have invested significant amounts of money into their data centers or their on-premises environments, right? It's not something they typically want to just throw away just yet, right? And it's understandable. Like, you spend a lot of money on it, so you might as well make use of it, right? So that's why I've personally seen a lot more hybrid cloud scenarios as of recent, in that, like, we don't want to necessarily throw that investment away, but we also want to move to the cloud. And so sometimes the best way to move all into the cloud is kind of taking that hybrid cloud approach. But the challenge then is become, how do I persist data from my on-premises environment into the cloud and back and forth? How do I protect that data? You get like latency issues, just because, if you're pulling data from your on-premises from the cloud, from different locations, like, all these become issues that you need to think about and solve, especially as you're developing that strategy, right? And obviously, I think there's ways that, we're seeing now that make it efficient and make it better for folks that are taking this approach. But yeah, I think it's something that we're going to be seeing a lot more as folks start to realize, like, hey, like, I don't necessarily need to throw away my investment into my on-premises environment just yet. Like, why can't I utilize both to still be effective with my customers, right? And I don't think it's going to actually go away anytime soon, because, a lot of folks in financial services, they need to keep certain applications on-prem. I don't think that's ever going to go away. So I think it's important for folks to start thinking about how to strategize around that, just because, you know, it is something that we're going to be seeing for quite some time.
Joe, you want to add to that? And I guess I'm looking at all this stuff where I'm seeing Kubernetes and containers deployed at the edge. And the idea is that essentially we're going to process and analyze data closer to where it's being created and consumed, so that we don't have to ship massive amounts of raw data over the WAN back to the cloud or an on-premise data center. So do you think, as that whole paradigm continues to evolve, that, you know, the way we do think about data architecture is changing, and the edge may be a big factor in driving this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely, without a shadow of doubt. I mean, I think any conversation with retail, especially, edge is a hot topic, right? Because the idea of being able to process in store, you know, run something on maybe an ARM-based system, right? Low energy, small kind of modular compute units, and then just ship it back to like some central processing center every night, which could be country specific. I mean, that's, you know, a lot of organizations are looking at that, right? And it's driving efficiencies in stock management. It's making them able to make better predictions around, you know, investments they need to make in their supply chain and so on. So it's massively powerful, but it brings its own set of challenges, right? Because storage in a small ARM-based edge environment is very different to what you're going to find in a data center, right? You're probably going to have local disks, maybe little NVMe, you know, PCIe devices, and nothing else, which is going to be very different to your highly available replicated SAN, or again, very different to what you get from AWS or someone like that. And I think if we kind of take a step back, I think the hybrid cloud, if we just park edge for a moment, even though there's a lot of crossover there, I think it's only really been a reality for the last few years. And I think you kind of have to look at the reasons behind it. So there was definitely this surge to move to public cloud because it will save money, right? And that kind of felt like it was a driver for a long time. But if we kind of go a layer above that, I think the best hybrid cloud implementations I've seen is where there's an ability, some kind of orchestrator above that could say, well, what's the reason you want to deploy this workload? Okay, you need a temporary dev environment. You don't really care about the longevity of this state. Let's just spin it up in AWS because we can get some, you know, some instances there that are going to be cheaper. We can tear it down. We don't need it anymore. And then actually maybe we need some low latency performance for production. So now let's bring it on-prem. And it's that kind of ability to suit the workload to the environment you're running it in that I think is the right way to go with hybrid cloud, right? And of course, behind the scenes, to make that work, you need to have the orchestration, you need to have the portability of the compute and the storage layers. As Andrew was saying, you need the low latency. But absolutely creating that kind of abstraction where, as Gaurav was saying, ultimately you are just wanting to deploy an application workload like the operator model supports, where a developer just says, I want a Cassandra. And it ends up in one of those environments. Is kind of the utopian dream that I see a lot of organizations aiming for in that kind of hybrid cloud model.
Well, we do have a question from somebody who wants to specifically ask about Pure Storage. So, you know, I'm short of making the full boat product pitch, but you know, basically the question is, if we have CSI drivers and we have Kubernetes, so what is the value add of software-defined storage layers that would sit atop of that, and why do folks need them?
Okay, let me get my I'm joking. I'm not going to open PowerPoint this time. No, I mean, I think it's what we've been talking about. You know, it's, for me, there are limitations when you tie yourself in, you lock yourself in, I should say, to a specific storage or any system, right? Any kind of backend. It limits the portability that containerization gives you. So while, you know, CSI CSI-based connectors into storage systems are certainly useful for allowing you to leverage your existing investment in storage, when we start to look at those hybrid cloud models that we've been talking about, or edge computing, where you don't have your SAN available, actually that becomes very challenging. How do you now move workloads from an on-premise environment into AWS to make use of their native storage? Well, that's incredibly challenging, right? And so if you create that overlay, create maybe virtual block or virtual volumes on top of the underlying infrastructure, then that virtual volume becomes as portable and as dynamic as a container. And suddenly they can be moved freely between environments. And so that's really That's really the driver that I see, which is, this is very much my space, right? The SDS side. That's the real kind of value prop that we see. Yeah.
All right. Gaurav, I want to ask you some block and tackle questions around backup and recovery, and because you're kind of the expert in that space. But if the containers are so ephemeral and they're here 1 minute and gone the next, what exactly am I backing up? And then what am I recovering? And what does that motion look like?
Yeah. So I think have an application, whether that's a particular data service or whether that's a more complex application, which under the cover uses multiple databases. From a business perspective, what you care about is making sure that that entire application gets backed up. And what that under the cover means is not only the data that gets generated as that application is executing during runtime, but all of the Kubernetes objects that are a part of it, whether it's your config maps or your secrets and so on. But also increasingly, then it's the data services. So we talked about the operator framework in some contexts. So that itself. So that's what you need to first of all back up. And your pods can get rescheduled between different nodes and so on in different regions. But that's why you need a Kubernetes native solution for backup and disaster recovery in today's world. I did want to maybe to liven this up a little bit. I did want to sort of maybe also point out, to Joe's point of view, that yes, we want portability, but there are different ways of solving that problem. One way is to go ahead and obviously have, a layer on top of a layer, which is like you might have a block implementation like EBS, and then you kind of put another layer over it. And then on the hybrid side, on premises, you might have another block implementation, and you go and put another, layer out there. And that gives you some level of abstraction and continuity. But then I think Kubernetes also allows you to sort of go ahead and get app mobility with constructs like CSI, where you have abstracted and had things like storage classes. So you can go ahead and also get a level of portability into the system, where one of the common use cases we see is essentially people saying, look, I want to maybe take snapshots, but I want to back them up for durability reasons in a different place. And maybe the underlying infrastructure there is different. So you can also work at the CSI level, and also I know in our product we do end up supporting things where we can change dynamically the storage classes and so on, and get that level of specificity too. So to me, I think I don't want to make this a product pitch, but what I wanted to highlight here was Kubernetes, because it's such a dynamic environment and it's also more or less omnipresent and it's getting more and more available inside edges, you can solve problems in different ways. And I think you need to make sure that the customers are understanding the benefits of, on one hand, leveraging all of the innovation that various storage vendors might be bringing to the table, in addition to their own business needs of making sure that they're not trapped in a particular vendor solution and a particular deployment model. So I think there are different ways, and to me, that's one of the advantages of this ecosystem.
Do you think the compliance people are going to come knocking soon and say, we want to audit this environment? And it sounds like we're going to turn around and say, well, yeah, there's a couple of seconds or minutes in there where we have no idea where this ephemeral container was, and it got ripped and replaced, and we didn't capture it in any way. And do they need to change their mindset, or do the container people need to figure out a way to make the compliance people happy?
So I think just like the accountants never sleep, in my mind, the compliance folks also never sleep. At some point or the other, there is auditing required for a variety of reasons. And I think just to abstract that point a little bit, I am definitely seeing, for example, observability and security sort of munging into some similar thing, where not only for reasons for compliance, but also Kubernetes brings with it its own sort of security challenges in terms of opening up the surface area. So you do want to know what's happening under the hood, and you do want to know why it's happening at some points, either for troubleshooting reasons or for compliance reasons and so on. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, I think it is a reasonable requirement for folks to know where their applications are, why they might be talking to each other, and it opens up a whole new door in terms of privilege escalation. I know Andrew and I had talked about this in a different webinar at some point, but it's a subject by itself, and I think an interesting one.
Andrew, do you think that this topic?
I think there's an important point that I kind of want to call it here because I think it is something that should be understood. Is when you talk about compliance, storage, and just Kubernetes, I think the way it's headed right now, and I think Rob said it really well, is I think this becomes like a governance issue. I think in my mind, this is what it ends up becoming because kind of like Rob mentioned, right? Like within most platforms or most solutions, you're going to have a standardized dashboard where you can kind of take a look at what's going on within your environment. And as part of that, you may have distributed tracing so that, to your point, if a container goes down, you know exactly when it went down, why it went down, and probably even how it went down, right? Like you need that level of governance within your platforms or whatever solution you may be using, so that when you do go through those compliance reviews, you have that information for whoever's doing that review, right? So for me, it's more of a governance issue, and I think within those dashboards, you need to be able to see every layer of what's going on within your environment because at the end of the day, that's what they're going to be auditing, right? So for me, it's a governance issue, and that's kind of the way I see it.
Yeah. So if that's the case, guys, let's think about this for a minute. On the one hand, we want everything to shift left because of DevOps. On the other side, we want data to be managed more like an asset and it's more strategic. So, Andrew, who's in charge of all this stuff these days? Who makes that call and who decides what the right platform is and what the right architecture is? Because depending on who I talk to, it's a developer one day, and then the other day it's a chief data officer. So what's going on?
In all honesty, I think it's a shared responsibility, right? It shouldn't just be one person making that decision. I think it needs to be an informed decision with everyone within your organization, because at the end of the day, that's what you're gonna be working on, right? So, if there's one person making all the decisions on what solutions they're using or platforms they're using, but the rest of your organization doesn't agree, well, you're not gonna have a very good time kind of managing, operating whatever decision that person made. So I think, honestly, it should be a shared responsibility because there's just so many different layers that you need to think about, right? When it comes to networking, storage, observability, security, like these are all different responsibilities that different people within your organization are going to have. So I don't think it's necessarily one person or maybe a team that should be making that decision. I think it should be more of an informed decision. And that's why I say it should be a shared responsibility because they all relate to each other, right? Because going back to storage, right, there's a security aspect to it. Like how do we make sure that only the right folks have access to that data that we're storing, right? How do we encrypt it? How do we back it up? How do we make it highly available? How do we scale it, right? There's all these different things that go into it that are going to go across different teams within your organization. So for that reason, I think it should be a shared responsibility, not necessarily one team or one person's responsibility.
Joe, do you agree with that? We got to get 22 people in a room around a table and they all got to come to an agreement. Is that how that's going to play out?
Well, I mean, I completely agree it's a shared responsibility. Whether or not there's 22 people or not is another matter. But I mean, look, I don't think it's that different to how infrastructure decisions are made. I mean, if you look at an RFP, it may be a traditional storage RFP, but it's going to have, something about containers included. And that's kind of what we're seeing, right? And look at Tanzu and VMware. The responsibilities around Kubernetes are now becoming part of for some organizations, probably part of the VMware team to manage, right? So I don't think it's a case of there is a brand new set of Kubernetes people who now have to become experts in their particular area, who are independent from maybe the more machine-centric infrastructure-focused people. It's exactly as Andrew was saying, right? It's a case of everyone who's responsible for a different layer of the stack needs to bring their expertise to be involved in making decisions around how this platform should be designed.
Yeah, I think, Mike, if I can, I wanted to add maybe with a concrete example, right? So to Andrew's point about sort of the shared services platform model, first of all, of course, it's very clear that, hey, look, you, Mr. Enterprise or Mr. Application Owner, are responsible for example, backing up your application and restoring it. AWS would take care of the infrastructure side of it. But what we're also seeing, and this, in some ways ties in your point around sort of DevOps principles, is backup and recovery, for example, used to be thought of as a day 2 service. You kind of had your application out there, you went into production, and then you thought about, I need to be compliant or whatever, and so let me make sure I have a backup process in place too. In this new world, what we are seeing is the platform and the cluster, when you bring it up itself, the platform team brings with it backup capabilities again, there's a rich set of vendors. You pick up the best tool out there, but those tools can be configured to be forward-looking in terms of policies. So the application owners can continue to go ahead and creating their own applications and introducing to the cluster, but they're automatically put under an umbrella policy coverage to say that, yes, they will be backed up. And as an application owner, now you might have a self-service portal to be able to recover the entire application or parts of that application. So now backup and recovery is not a day 2 service. It's almost being baked in as a day 0 service as a part of that initial cluster bring up. So to me, that reflects not only the, I was joking about the mindset change, but it's also the development methodologies and deployment methodologies have changed. But also, I think the way you think about who's doing the work has also now, in some ways, simplified. You don't need to be opening tickets and passing them here and there. The platform services team is going ahead and baking some of these capabilities like backup and recovery in there, but it's the application owners who care about being able to, at times, with the right, obviously, authorization and authentication, be able to bring up their application back to what they might want to for a variety of reasons. So I think that's the way I see it, and it's actually making things move faster and actually a lot more productively.
Andrew, do you agree with that? Are things getting a lot more automated? I mean, for all I know, maybe artificial intelligence is just going to take care of all this someday. But, what is the future of automation around storage and containers these days?
It's funny that you mentioned that. I was just watching this video on I think you guys probably know the GitHub Copilot, where it will code for you using AI. So yeah, I do think automation is definitely a key player in a lot of decisions that are being made today. Because think about what Kubernetes does for you. It automates a lot of this stuff for you, whether it's bringing up pods, whether it's dynamic provisioning storage for your pods. There's a lot of automation that goes into a lot of these decisions, right? I think that's a common question I get a lot from customers that are new to the space of containers is, obviously there's a lot of automation involved, but what does that actually mean for me, right? How do I then teach my organization how to automate a lot of our processes that are very manual as of today, right? So I think, automation is going to be a key factor for a lot of organizations that are looking to invest in containers. And, because at the end of the day, containers are supposed to make the development process a lot easier for your organization, right? In that it's supposed to help you get to market faster. And you have to ask yourself, well, how does that actually happen under the hood? It's all through automation, right? And I think it's a key factor that people need to take into consideration before they actually make a decision on what platform or what solution that they're going to invest into. Because, the reason why you make these decisions in the first place is it's supposed to make your life easier for your organization and your teams. And if it's going to make it more manual, if it's going to make it more harder to manage or upgrade, then what's the point, right? You're kind of just wasting your time at that point. So I think automation is always going to play a key factor in any decision that an organization makes into their infrastructure, the platform, or the solution. You name it, it's always going to be there.
Joe, do you agree with that? Are we going to see maybe storage folks replaced by automation and AI, or is it more a question of augmenting them and trying to figure out, where to strike the balance between the man and the machine interfaces?
I absolutely agree. And if I look at the biggest customers that we work with, some of their challenges are really around that day 2 operational piece where they've got hundreds or thousands of nodes in very large Kubernetes clusters, and problems that you might not necessarily associate with Kubernetes, like capacity management, actually become huge problems because, of course, capacity can cause applications to crash, and having a DevOps team suddenly be responsible for automating capacity management across heterogeneous environments is a big ask, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. We've built capabilities into our own SDS that take care of that. And I know there are other solutions in that space as well that are kind of Kubernetes native around capacity management. But I think it's not just capacity, right? It's also the point that Gaurav was making around baking in backup. We see that for DR. It's that super low RPO capability of just flicking a switch and seeing everything fail over. It's not just about the data. It's also about the applications and remapping all of your volumes to the correct workload. And that whole piece is incredibly complex, right? And so being able to wrap automation around that so that an SRE or a platform team, or whoever it happens to be who's responsible for that, can see see their dashboards light up, and then they look at the next dashboard where their Kubernetes stack is being monitored, and everything goes green again because it all flips over and comes back online, right? And so it's those kind of capabilities, especially in the more mature and larger use cases, that are just absolutely critical, right? And I don't think they're going to replace storage admins at all. It's actually going to give them the additional tools required to run these complex distributed systems.
All right, gentlemen, we're going to play a little game. Gaurav, we're going to ask you this question first. You have been appointed king for the day of all of container storage, and you can do anything you want. You can tell the community to do anything that they should be doing. What's top of the list? What's the first thing you're going to do?
Oh my God, that's a lot of power you're giving me, Mike. I'm digesting, and maybe let me relish that for a moment. No, in all honesty, I think, like I said, the thing which I would love to see happening is, first of all, like I said, there's innovation across the entire stack that I'm seeing. So first of all, as a king, I'm going to make sure that that innovation stays alive, right, across all the layers. You don't want separation of concerns is, I think, one of the formulas for success. Doesn't matter. In my past life, I was involved in sort of the TCP/IP stack and CDNs and so on. In this life, it's a different thing. But the point is, in each one of those cases, you want to make sure that the people who do the physical part of it, whether it's NVMe or there was this talk about sort of DNA and so on, continues. I want to make sure that the operator frameworks have a way of being able to digest each one of those things. So I think that's something, first of all, as separation of concerns. You don't want to munch storage and data management, etc., into a single layer and force people down a particular path from a development and deployment perspective. So as a king, I want to make sure that spirit stays alive. And then I think I have my laundry list of things which are sort of more here and now. I mean, for example, we talked about CSI. A lot of work has been done. It's so easy to consume storage now and do that in a dynamic binding way. But there's so much more work to be done, right? I mean, whether it's about making sure that when you're going ahead and doing things like change block tracking so you can do efficient snapshots and so on, or when you're able to do a way of doing data population of taking data from a snapshot. Those are all capabilities which I think are extremely important, important as stateful applications become mainstream. And to me, that continues to be a path where the storage vendors are all working very well with each other to get that going, but we can definitely go even faster. So I think with the king and maybe the power, hopefully, that comes with it, that would be nice to have.
All right, Andrew, you're king for the day. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I think just to kind of expand on Gaurav's point, I think with innovation, I think it also lowers the entry for kind of being an SME in the space. And I think a great example is I have a close friend whose younger sibling is attending University of Houston, and they actually have classes on the cloud now, right? But like, I know when I was in school, like that was not even a thing, right? And I think the more we innovate, I think the more we allow for newer folks to come into the space and become those SMEs. Because it just becomes easier to learn, right? Because before, like the cloud, I mean, learning about how to operate a data center or becoming a systems admin, it was, I would argue it was difficult, right? But I think now with more innovation we see, it just allows more people to kind of come into the space and be that go-to person for the organization. So yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think innovation is the key here. As long as that keeps going, can't really add much to that.
All right, Joe, come on, bring us home. What are you going to be? What's the big first edict?
I'd go back to the earlier point. You said, what are the kind of pitfalls that people, kind of end up tripping up and falling into? Yeah, I think I'd want to start some kind of education program around not making the same mistakes, right? We've seen this pattern of kind of organizations looking at point solutions and then struggling to integrate them further down the line, and that kind of really impacting their ability to be agile, especially when their needs evolve. And I was talking about the criticality of apps previously. So I would really find a way to advocate that platform approach, I think, and to try and help people avoid making that point solution mistake.
All right, let's bring it around full circle with tongue less in cheek, but you guys are experts in this space. Guave, we'll start with you again. What's your best advice to folks, other than obviously hanging out on your company's website? But what exactly, what do you think people should be doing if they're just getting started or they're down the path a little bit of the way? What would you be thinking about?
Yeah, no. So look, first of all, I think you when you're starting on a particular path, you want to play in the right space. So I think Kubernetes Cloud Native is definitely the right space out here, because I think that whole ecosystem is very much growing. And so the next step after that, and by the way, just as a data point on that, I think I know Morgan Stanley had a really good report, which I particularly enjoyed reading. So I would expect people or advise people to go just take a look at that. I think they had this, it was authored, the new stack spend. And really the point being made was, if you look at software development methodologies, which are driving all the benefits we spoke about, and it's become like a boardroom conversation, just like cybersecurity was a few years ago and probably still is. Now, this new stack, which is sort of the new SQL databases, it's the new data integration services, that's going to be outpacing the spend on the way people are being used to going ahead and producing software and deploying it. And that's close to $50 billion over the next few years. So first of all, it's the right place to play in. So the second question to answer your point is getting educated. So in addition to going and hanging out at Kasten.io, where, by the way, we do have educational resources, you can go ahead and start getting a lot more involved and active on the CNCF side. And I think that's one really rich part of it. So I think that's vendor neutral. You can go ahead and sort of learn a lot more and truly be even a part of all of that innovation, which I was alluding to across various layers. So I think that's the best way to get involved in this community.
All right, Andrew, we're down to the last 4 minutes. Quick piece of advice.
Yeah, I think the most successful folks I've seen kind of in this space, they all take an outcome-based approach into whether it's learning, whether it's making a decision, or what have you. And you kind of just have to ask yourself why, well, what am I going to get by learning something like Kubernetes, right? What am I going to get by learning more about storage? What am I going to learn by doing any of this, right? You have to figure out why you want to do this in the first place. Just because when you think about the CNCF landscape, it is very, very broad, and you can get lost very, very quickly. And if you take a look at the project map, if you will, from the CNCF, there are a lot of different solutions on that map, and it's really easy to get kind of overwhelmed by kind of what you see on there. But again, if you at least understand why you're kind of going down this path, I think it makes navigating that process a lot easier. So I think, again, just taking that outcome-based approach will play a huge difference as you're kind of going down this path. So that would be my piece of advice.
All right, Joe, 1 minute. What do you got?
Well, I was also going to talk about the community getting involved, ask. But I think if I think about the customers we work with, the people who are driving the most change, being catalysts in those organizations, they are not afraid to ask questions. So again, maybe it's not specifically related to Kubernetes, but I would say if you're in an organization, you think there's an opportunity to use some of the technologies we've been talking about to drive innovation and change in the business and to deliver value, don't be afraid to challenge people, because most of the time they'll actually be glad that you did.
All right, great. Hey, I want to thank our experts for sharing their knowledge and their insights today. Our winners of the gift certificates are Matt L., Pete T., Vasanta T., and Andrew H. Thank you all for spending some time with us. It was our pleasure to have this chat, and we wish you all best of luck in your future Kubernetes container storage adventures. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much. Appreciate it.